Welcome to the Energy Forum, the podcast where we explore critical issues shaping the future of energy and public policy. I'm Ken Medlock, Senior Director of the Center for Energy Studies at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Today, we're diving into a topic that lies at the heart of Texas's economic resilience and future growth: water infrastructure. As our state's population and industries continue to expand, the demand for water and the strain on our infrastructure are growing rapidly. Without adequate investment and planning, the consequences could be severe, impacting everything from public health to economic stability. Leading this important discussion is Gabriel Collins, Baker Bott's Fellow in Energy and Environmental Regulatory Affairs at the Baker Institute. Gabe is the author of a key report commissioned by Texas 2036, which outlines the costs and consequences of insufficient investment in Texas's water infrastructure. Joining Gabriel is Jeremy Mazur, Director of Infrastructure and Natural Resources Policy at Texas 2036. In addition to his work driving strategic investments in Texas's infrastructure, Jeremy also authored a report that highlights solutions to secure the state's water future. Together, they'll unpack the report's findings and discuss the critical steps needed to build a resilient water system for Texas. Gabe, Jeremy, take it away.
Thanks, Ken. Let's start by laying out the issue Texas is facing with its water infrastructure. A lot of the systems we rely on, pipes, reservoirs, treatment plants, are getting old and just aren't built to handle the kind of growth we're seeing. By 2050, the state is expected to add nearly 15 million more people, which is going to put even more strain on an already stretched system. The consequences of not addressing this are serious. If we don't invest now, we're looking at potential water shortages that could cost the state nearly $14 billion a year by 2036. Beyond that, it could hurt industries like agriculture, energy, and manufacturing, disrupt communities, and also make Texas more vulnerable to droughts and flooding. Investing early in water infrastructure isn't just the smart thing to do, it's the cheaper option in the long run. That's what we're here to talk about today: the challenges, the risks, and most importantly, the solutions. Jeremy, can you tell us a little bit about your work at Texas 2036 and how you approach tackling these water issues?
Hey, Gabe, thanks for having me here. So at Texas 2036, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit, data-driven think tank. Our North Star is to make Texas the best place to live and work by the time of our bicentennial, which is 2036. Is why we have the funny name Texas 2036. Our approach is when we look at the state's water challenges, we see two big water challenges affecting the state. First, we need to develop a broad, diversified water supply portfolio for a drought-prone and growing state. The second issue is that we need to address and tackle the problem of aging, deteriorating drinking water and wastewater systems that are fast becoming liabilities to the communities that they serve.
And so as we look at these systems that, as I think you very well put it, are aging, what are some of the areas where we do see positive stories, and what are things that we can do better or maybe even accelerate moving forward to start addressing these infrastructure problems and set the foundation for the future that we're each looking toward?
There are a bunch of policy levers out there that we can talk about when we want to talk about the issue of aging, deteriorating drinking water and wastewater systems, such as technical assistance or assessing whether or not some utilities are failing or at risk of failing. But I think perhaps the most fundamental salient issue we need to talk about right now is the state's financial strategy for addressing the issues attributable to these types of water systems, but also the issue associated with our water supply needs. And so last year, the legislature and state voters approved creation of the Texas Water Fund that appropriated $1 billion for both water supply and water infrastructure projects. What we know, though, is that the $1 billion that the legislature and voters approved last year falls woefully short of the amount of investment the state really needs to make for our long-term water infrastructure challenges.
And as we think about that funding gap, what do the needs look like as we go from 2024 to 2030 to 2035 to 2045 and so forth?
Well, let's talk about the funding gap. And so we'll start by itemizing the costs. We know, according to the inflation-adjusted state water plan data, that the state of Texas will need to invest about $59 billion over the next 50 years on water supply projects. Inflation-adjusted EPA cost estimates for fixing our aging, deteriorating drinking water and wastewater systems runs about $72 billion and $21.1 billion over the next 20 years. So all told, the state of Texas will have to invest at least $154 billion over the next 50 years on all of our water infrastructure challenges. Keep in mind that's over 50 years. The state is projected to provide only about $42 or $43 billion in financial assistance over the next 50 years. This means that we have a long-term funding gap of about $112, $113 billion over the next 50 years to address our water infrastructure challenges. What we're doing going into the next legislative session is trying to make the policy and business case about why the legislature needs to have sustained investments in water infrastructure to fix the systems that are failing, to develop the water supplies that need to be built, as basically not only to avoid potential economic consequences, but also to provide, as you guys mentioned, an insurance strategy for growth in the future.
Absolutely. And so as we kind of break down the math here, we think of a $110 billion gap over a 50-year period. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm assuming this doesn't necessarily come out to a neat average of $2 billion a year, that there's probably differences in distribution. How does it look decade by decade as we think about the challenge in front of us in meeting those funding needs?
A lot of those costs are essentially over the next 2 or 3 decades. So we have a lot of investment that we need to do in the remainders of this decade, the 2030s and the 2040s. If we put off making these investments until after then, these projects are just going to get more expensive. And what's looking at a $154 billion price tag now could well be $200, $300 billion price tag several decades from now. So it is cheaper and more cost effective for the state to rip off the Band-Aid and start addressing these issues now as opposed to later.
What are some of the mechanisms that you think could potentially be used? You know, we've talked about the $1 billion that was appropriated initially for the Texas Water Fund. As we look beyond this, what are potentially sustainable funding mechanisms to help close this gap?
Well, the legislature last year was fortunate insofar as that a red-hot state economy gave the legislature a significant budget surplus to work with. And out of that significant budget surplus, they allocated $1 billion towards water infrastructure, as well as billions to other state priorities, such as broadband, parks, and even energy. Looking at the method of finance moving forward, there are several models that the legislature can consider in 2025. For example, we use dedicated funding from our state severance tax and state sales taxes to pay for the Texas Highway Fund, to pay for roads and highways. And since those dedicated funding streams were adopted in 2014 and 2015, that has yielded about $35 billion over the past decade for Texas roads and highways. We also use a sales tax dedication to pay for state parks. That has also been successful in raising a significant amount of money for the state to develop parks and historic sites. So our argument for the legislature this session is that the state's economy has been growing. There's widespread evidence in terms of like the amount of GDP growth over the past decade. That's evidence of this significant economic growth. When your economy grows and your GDP goes up as part of that growth, so do your sales tax revenues. And so we think that there's a substantial amount of sales tax dollars that could be dedicated every year to go towards our water infrastructure challenges.
As we think about the positive and negative sides of this ledger here, what is your impression in terms of the understanding in Austin and elsewhere of just how substantial some of the downside consequences could be if we were to run short of water in Texas?
You know, there are 2 reports that just came out. I wrote one for Texas 2036, and you wrote another report from the Baker Institute at Rice University that explores this question in detail. I think one thing that we point out in our report is that when you adjust some of the estimates in the state water plan of what the economic consequences will be from failure to invest in water infrastructure, we're looking at GDP losses in the 2030s and 2050s that greatly exceed the economic damages that we endured in Texas during the Great Recession and the COVID pandemic. So we know that from the water supply portfolio alone, if you don't expand your water supply portfolio and you're hit by another long, severe drought, you're looking at Great Recession, COVID pandemic, like economic losses time two. The same is also true for failing to address your aging, deteriorating drinking water and wastewater systems, where your aggregate economic losses could exceed $320 billion by year 2039. And for comparison, Gabe, that's the size of our state budget. But there's a fascinating finding in your report, which goes into detail about what will happen to our state's electric grid if we don't have enough water supplies during the next long, severe drought. And so what really blew you away when you had that section in that report?
Absolutely. And so as I step into the trap I inadvertently set for myself here, I would gladly elaborate on that. So one of the really eye-opening things for me, and this is coming from someone who's fundamentally an energy and commodity person, is I had started with the initial assumption that Texas's move to more natural gas-fired power, as well as increasing penetration of wind and solar, would really attenuate this energy-water linkage. And actually what I found as I ran through the data is still about a third of our power generating capacity, particularly the dispatchable capacity, is very water exposed. There's plants that are so-called once-through facilities that have to withdraw massive amounts of water from rivers or lakes, or in a couple of cases, the ocean, to be able to maintain their thermodynamic balance and generate electricity. And then there's a whole large portion of other plants that use cooling towers and aren't quite as water intensive, but are still very water dependent. And so the bottom line is, given how important dispatchable power is to maintaining balance in our system with the new mix of resources that we have, we still have very tight linkages to water availability. And if that were to be impaired, we could be in a world of hurt on the ERCOT grid.
That was what in the political world we would call a holy cow finding, because I think what you said is that there's this water energy nexus out there. And if we are hit by a long, severe drought, like Texas was in 2011, when a gas-fired electric plant did go offline because of water shortages, but if we're hit by another long, severe drought, a substantial portion of the state's electric grid could be at risk of not being able to operate. And that invites the real political problem of rolling blackouts or unreliable electric service, which could very well reverse the Texas economic miracle. I mean, politically, this is a big deal.
Absolutely. The consequences could be disastrous. What I used in the report as a benchmark to help people understand some of the numbers we're coming up with are the damages that Winter Storm Uri caused. And a lot of those stemmed from the electricity system disruption. That was probably $190 to $200 billion damages event. And you could see something of similar magnitude with a drought-induced power disruption. In many ways, it would be worse because with Uri, it was an event that lasted about a week, and then we were in recovery mode. If you're talking a repeat of the 1950s drought, or especially some of the droughts that we see in the paleogeological record over the last few hundreds of years that in some instances were worse, these are disruptions that aren't just a week. These are things that can go on for months or even years. There would probably be adaptive measures we would undertake during that time, but still you would be in a state of the world that, frankly speaking, modern Texas has never experienced. And it's somewhere that we probably would rather not go. In a lot of these things with proper preventative and preemptive investment in infrastructure for water, we can avoid them.
And when you talk about those adaptive measures, we're talking about building out water supply portfolio, better water reuse, potentially desalination, better water conservation, fixing your leaking pipes. All of those are part of that basket of options that you have as part of your adaptation curve. The point that we make in both of our reports is that it's much cheaper for the state to make these investments now than in 20 or 30 years from now. And so in terms of like making that business and policy case for state policymakers, we're making that argument like a dollar spent today saves you from spending $10 to $20 in 10 years from now.
Absolutely. If crisis is the mother of short-term adaptive innovation, we would rather invest to grow is the bottom line with this. It's always better to be ahead of the problem. And this is something where we can see, in this case, it's not storm clouds on the horizon, maybe dust clouds on the horizon would make a little more sense as a metaphor. We can see those warning signs there. And to your point earlier, we saw on Lake Palo Pinto, we saw the R.W. Martin power plant have to shut down for almost 6 months toward the tail end of the 2011 to 2015 dry period. We saw power plants during 2011 that had to pipe in water from adjacent rivers, in some cases had to violate their temperature permits in order to maintain generation. And so we have the warnings there. I think maybe one of the biggest differences is some of the shock absorbers that Texas had in the 1950s, and even to some extent in 2011, we don't have to nearly the same measure today. And if you're driving a vehicle that has fewer shock absorbers, you really don't want to go over sharp bumps. And if you can see those bumps ahead in the road and level them off, it's in your interest to do so. And this is really the decision-making point that we're at politically as a state now is, are we going to start leveling those bumps? And I think, as you've seen in the report, my strong position is yes, we should.
So it's interesting because water infrastructure investment or state water infrastructure investment works two ways. One, it helps you avoid severe economic consequences from insufficient water infrastructure. This includes water shortages that could incur rolling blackouts, communities going without water, or communities suffering from the consequences of having aging, deteriorating systems such as unreliable water system. So in the first sense, water infrastructure investments help you avoid these terrible economic consequences. That's the insurance aspect that you describe in your report. The other thing that I think the legislature knows about water infrastructure investment is just as it serves as insurance to avoid these economic harms, it provides a very solid foundation for continued economic growth and development. There's one study that you point out in your report, Gabe, where every 100,000 acre feet of incremental water supply could potentially support, what was it, $30 billion in new economic development?
Absolutely, approximately $30 billion. Yes, this was looking at the water consumption of the large triangle metros and then the metropolitan area gross domestic product that you see each year from those areas, and just deriving a simple mathematical function of, okay, we have this many billions of dollars of economic output in a given year, whether it's San Antonio, Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, Austin, et cetera. And here's how much water, as best as we can tell, was used in those areas. And you're correct. That's the ratio, is every 100,000 acre feet of water, you can potentially underpin about $30 billion worth of annual economic activity.
And I think what the legislature is seeing too is like they're seeing how the entire state of Texas is benefiting from the Texas economic miracle. We're seeing more jobs, we're seeing rapid economic growth, we're seeing the state being not only the nation but also the world's energy leader. These are all great things, in fact, blessings for the state of Texas. The legislature is also recognizing that you need to have certain pieces of infrastructure in place to make this work. The first being a reliable electric grid. How after Winter Storm Uri, the legislature has really made reliable, affordable electric service a political priority. They're also coming around to recognizing that just as you need a reliable, dependable electric grid, you also need reliable water infrastructure in order to keep not only protect the Texas economic miracle from potential consequences, but also to provide that strong foundation for its expansion in the future.
When you think of the Texas economy as a Clydesdale horse, there's basically four legs. One is the work ethic and the talents of all of our fellow citizens of Texas. One of the second leg is good governance and a pro-business environment. The third leg is reliable electricity, and the fourth leg is a reliable water system. And I don't know about you, but I've never seen a three-legged Clydesdale horse that could pull a big, heavy wagon.
It would be a very special horse. So, yeah, I
maybe we'll see that one this year in the Super Bowl commercials, but I haven't seen it yet. And I think Texas, we want the four-legged horse, and we've got the chance to invest in it.
Definitely pro four-legged horse. So, totally agree with that. Another issue is that with the legislative session starting just around the corner in 2025, voters have water on their mind too. At Texas 2036, we do this thing called the Texas Voter Poll. And we just released our 8th Texas Voter Poll earlier this month. And we ask voters questions about different things, like their confidence in the state government, what they think about housing, healthcare, as well as energy. And we also include some questions about water. A couple of things are noteworthy, like first, 85% of Texas voters are concerned about the reliability of their future water supplies. We also found out in this poll that 85% of voters are supportive of the legislature making long-term investments to develop reliable water infrastructure. And in addition, 68% of voters said that they are supportive of the legislature creating a $1 billion per year dedicated funding stream for the Texas Water Fund. So politically, we're seeing that voters are worried about their water supplies, but they're supportive of the legislature taking aggressive action to make sure we have the reliable water infrastructure we need for the Texas economic miracle.
Absolutely. There's social license to invest. And I think this is very much a situation where we want to invest to grow, and there's a great opportunity in front of us. Well, Jeremy, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your insights. This has been a fabulous discussion.
Gabe, it is great to be on the Rice University campus today. The partnership we've had between Texas 2036 and the Baker Institute on these reports has been wonderful. Look forward to doing it again with you sometime soon.
The Energy Forum is brought to you by the Center for Energy Studies at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. This episode was produced by Maram Hijazi. AV production was led by Andrew Murillo. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org/center-energy-studies to learn more. Thanks for listening.